The Girl at the Gate. Something very strange happened the night old Mr. Lawrence died. I have never been able to explain it, and I have never spoken of it except to one person, and she said that I dreamed it. I did not dream it. I saw and heard waking. We had not expected Mr. Lawrence to die then. He did not seem very ill, not nearly so ill as he had been during his previous attack. When we heard of his illness, I went over to Woodlands to see him, for I had always been a great favourite with him. The big house was quiet, the servants going about their work as usual, without any appearance of excitement. I was told I could not see Mr. Lawrence for a little while, as the doctor was with him. Mrs. Yates, the housekeeper, said the attack was not serious, and asked me to wait in the blue parlour, but I preferred to sit down on the steps of the big, arched front door. It was an evening in June. Woodlands was very lovely. To my right was the garden, and before me was a little valley abrim with the sunset. In places under the big trees, it was quite dark even then. There was something unusually still in the evening, a stillness as of waiting. It kept me thinking of the last time Mr. Lawrence had been ill, nearly a year ago in August. One night, during his convalescence, I had watched by him to relieve the nurse. He had been sleepless and talkative, telling me many times about his life. Finally, he told me of Margaret. I knew a little about her, that she had been his sweetheart and had died very young. Mr. Lawrence had remained true to her memory ever since, but I had never heard him speak of her before. She was very beautiful, he said dreamily, and she was only 18 when she died, Jeanette. She had wonderful pale gold hair and dark brown eyes. I have a little ivory miniature of her. When I die, it is to be given to you, Jeanette. I have waited a long time for her. You know she promised she would come. I did not understand his meaning and kept silence, thinking that he might be wandering a little in his mind. She promised she would come, and she will keep her word, he went on. I was with her when she died. I held her in my arms. She said to me, "Herbert, I promise that I will be true to you forever, though as many years of lonely heaven as I must know before you come, and when your time is at hand, I will come to make your deathbed easy as you have made mine. I will come, Herbert." She solemnly promised Jeanette. We have made a death tryst of it, and I know she will come. He had fallen asleep then, and after his recovery he had not alluded to the matter again. I had forgotten it, but I recalled it now as I sat on the steps among the geraniums that June evening. I liked to think of Margaret, the lovely girl who had died so long ago, taking her lover's heart with her to the grave. She had been a sister of my grandfather, and people told me that I resembled her slightly. Perhaps that is why old Mr. Lawrence had always made such a pet of me. Presently the doctor came out and nodded to me cheerily. I asked him how Mr. Lawrence was. Better, better, he said briskly. He will be all right tomorrow. The attack is very slight. Yes, of course you may go in. Don't stay longer than half an hour. Mrs. Stewart, Mr. Lawrence's sister, was in the sick room when I went in. She took advantage of my presence to lie down on the sofa a little while, for she had been up all the preceding night. Mr. Lawrence turned his fine old silver head on the pillow and smiled a greeting. He was a very handsome old man. Neither age nor illness had marred his finely modelled face or impaired the flash of his keen steel-blue eyes. He seemed quite well and talked naturally and easily of many commonplace things. At the end of the doctor's half-hour, I rose to go. Mrs. Stewart had fallen asleep, and he would not let me wake her, saying he needed nothing and felt like sleeping himself. I promised to come up again on the morrow and went out. It was dark in the hall, where no lamp had been lighted, but outside on the lawn the moonlight was bright as day. It was the clearest, whitest night I ever saw. I turned aside into the garden, meaning to cross it and take the short way over the West Meadow home. There was a long walk of rose bushes leading across the garden to a little gate on the furthest side, the way Mr. Lawrence had been wont to take long ago when he went over the fields to woo Margaret. I went along it, enjoying the night. The bushes were white with roses, and the ground under my feet was all snowed over with their petals. The air was still and breezeless. Again I felt that sensation of waiting, of expectancy. As I came up to the little gate, I saw a young girl standing on the other side of it. She stood in the full moonlight, and I saw her distinctly. She was tall and slight, and her head was bare. I saw that her hair was a pale gold, shining somewhat strangely above her head, as if catching the moonbeams. Her face was very lovely, and her eyes large and dark. She was dressed in something white and softly shimmering, and in her hand she held a white rose, a very large and perfect one. Even at that time I found myself wondering where she could have picked it. It was not a woodlands rose. All the woodlands roses were smaller and less double. She was a stranger to me, and yet I felt I had seen her or someone very like her before. Possibly she was one of Mr. Lawrence's many nieces who might have come up to Woodlands upon hearing of his illness. As I opened the gate, I felt an odd chill of positive fear. Then she smiled as if I had spoken my thought. "Do not be frightened," she said. "There is no reason you should be frightened. I have only come to keep a tryst." The words reminded me of something, but I could not recall what it was. The strange fear that was on me deepened, but I could not speak. She came through the gateway and stood for a moment at my side. "It is strange that you should have seen me," she said, "but now behold how strong and beautiful a thing is faithful love, strong enough to conquer death. We who have loved truly love always, and this makes our heaven." She walked on after she had spoken, down the long rose path. I watched her until she reached the house and went up the steps. In truth, I thought the girl was someone not quite in her right mind. When I reached home, I did not speak of the matter to anyone, not even to inquire who the girl might possibly be. There seemed to be something in that strange meeting that demanded my silence. The next morning, word came that old Mr. Lawrence was dead. When I hurried down to Woodlands, I found all in confusion, but Mrs. Yates took me into the blue parlour and told me what little there was to tell. "He must have died soon after you left him, Miss Jeanette," she sobbed, "for Mrs. Stewart wakened at 10 o'clock and he was gone. He lay there, smiling, with such a strange look on his face, as if he had just seen something that had made him wonderfully happy. I never saw such a look on a dead face before." "Who was here, besides Mrs. Stewart?" I asked. "Nobody," said Mrs. Yates. "We have sent word to all his friends, but they have not had time to arrive here yet." "I met a young girl in the garden last night," I said slowly. "She came into the house. I did not know her, but I thought she must be a relative of Mr. Lawrence's." Mrs. Yates shook her head. "No, it must have been somebody from the village, although I didn't know of anyone calling after you went away." I said nothing more to her about it. After the funeral, Mrs. Stewart gave me Margaret's miniature. I had never seen it or any picture of Margaret before. The face was very lovely, also strangely like my own, although I am not beautiful. It was the face of the young girl I had met at the gate. The Fraser Scholarship. Elliot Campbell came down the main staircase of Marwood College and found himself caught up with a hoop into a crowd of sophs who were struggling around the bulletin board. He was thumped on the back and shaken hands with amid a hurricane of shouts and congratulations. "Good for you, Campbell. You've won the Fraser. See your little name tacked up there on top of the list, bracketed off all by itself for the winner. Elliot H. Campbell, 92%. A class yell for Campbell, boys." While the yell was being given with a heartiness that might have endangered the roof, Elliot, with flushed face and sparkling eyes, pushed nearer to the important typewritten announcement on the bulletin board. Yes, he had won the Fraser Scholarship. His name headed the list of 7 competitors. Roger Brooks, who was at his side, read over the list aloud. "Elliot H. Campbell, 92. I said you'd do it, my boy. Edward Stone, 91. Old Ned ran you close, didn't he? But of course with that name he'd no show. K. Milton, 88. Who'd have thought slow-going old K would have pulled up so well? Seddon Brown, 87. Oliver Field, 84. Roger McIntyre, 82. A very respectable little trio. And Carl McLean, 70. Phew, what a drop. Just saved his distance. It was only his name took him in, of course. He knew you weren't supposed to be strong in mathematics. Before Elliot could say anything, a professor emerged from the president's private room, bearing the report of a freshman examination, which he proceeded to post on the freshman bulletin board, and the rush of the students in that direction left Elliot and Roger free of the crowd. They seized the opportunity to escape. Elliot drew a long breath as they crossed the campus in the fresh April sunshine, where the buds were swelling on the fine old chestnuts and elms that surrounded Marwood's red brick walls. "That has lifted a great weight off my mind," he said frankly. "A good deal depended on my winning the Fraser. I couldn't have come back next year if I hadn't got it. That 400 will put me through the rest of my course." "That's good," said Roger Brooks heartily. He liked Elliot Campbell, and so did all the sophomores. Yet none of them was at all intimate with him. He had no chums as the other boys had. He boarded alone, dug persistently, and took no part in the social life of the college. Roger Brooks came nearest to being his friend of any, yet even Roger knew very little about him. Elliot had never before said so much about his personal affairs as in the speech just recorded. "I'm poor, woefully poor," went on Elliot gaily. His success seemed to have thawed his reserve for the time being. "I had just about enough money to bring me through fresh and soft years by dint of careful management. Now I'm stone broke, and the hope of the Fraser was all that stood between me and the dismal certainty of having to teach next year. Dropping out of my class and coming back in 2 or 3 years' time, a complete rusty stranger again. Phew, I made faces over the prospect." "No wonder," commented Roger. "The class would have been sorry if you'd had to drop out, Campbell. We want to keep all our stars with us to make a shining coronation at the finish. Besides, you know we all like you for yourself. It would have been an everlasting shame if that little cad of a McLean had won out. Nobody likes him." "Oh, I had no fear of him," answered Elliot. "I don't see what induced him to go in anyhow. He must have known he'd had no chance. But I was afraid of Stone. He's a born debaster of mathematics, you know, and I only hold my own in them by hard digging." "Why, Stone couldn't have taken the Fraser over you in any case, if you made over 70, said Roger with a puzzled look. "You must have known that. McLean was the only competitor you had to fear." "I don't understand you," said Elliot blankly. "You must know the conditions of the Fraser," exclaimed Roger. "Certainly," responded Elliot. "The Fraser Scholarship, amounting to £400, will be offered annually in the sophomore class. The competitors will be expected to take a special examination in mathematics, and the winner will be awarded $200 for 2 years, payable in 4 annual installments. The payment of any installment to be conditional on the winners attending the required classes for undergraduates and making satisfactory progress within. Isn't that correct?" "So far as it goes, old man. You forget the most important part of all. Preference is to be given to competitors of the name Fraser, Campbell, or McLean, provided that such a competitor makes at least 70% in his examination. You don't mean to tell me you didn't know that?" "Are you joking?" demanded Elliot, with a pale face. "Not a joke. Why, man, it's in the calendar." "I didn't know it," said Elliot slowly. "I read the calendar announcement only once, and I certainly didn't notice that condition." "Well, that's curious. But how on earth did you escape hearing it talked about? It's always discussed extensively among the boys, especially when there are 2 competitors of the favoured names, which doesn't happen often." "I'm not a sociable fellow," said Elliot, with a faint smile. "You know they call me the Hermit. As it happened, I never talked the matter over with anyone, or heard it referred to. I wish I had known this before." "Why, what difference does it make? It's all right anyway. But it is odd to think that if your name hadn't been Campbell, the Fraser would have gone to McLean over the heads of Stone and all the rest. Their only hope was that you would both fall below 70. It's an absurd condition, but there it is in old Professor Fraser's will. He was rich and had no family, so he left a number of bequests to the college on ordinary conditions. I suppose he thought he might humour his whim in one. His widow is a dear old soul, and always makes a special pet of the boy who wins the Fraser. Well, here's my street. So long, Campbell. Elliot responded almost curtly, and walked onward to his boarding house with a face from which all the light had gone. When he reached his room, he took down the Marwood calendar and whirled over the leaves until he came to the announcement of bursaries and scholarships. The Fraser announcement, as far as he had read it, ended at the foot of the page. He turned the leaf, and, sure enough, at the top of the next page, in a paragraph by itself, was the condition: preference shall be given to candidates of the name Fraser, Campbell, or Maclean, provided that said competitor makes at least 70% in his examination. Elliot flung himself into a chair by his table and bowed his head on his hands. He had no right to the Fraser Scholarship. His name was not Campbell, although perhaps nobody in the world knew it save himself, and he remembered it only by an effort of memory. He had been born in a rough mining camp in British Columbia, and when he was a month old, his father, John Hanselpacker, had been killed in a mine explosion, leaving his wife and child quite penniless and almost friendless. One of the miners, an honest, kindly Scotsman named Alexander Campbell, had befriended Mrs. Hanselpacker and her little son in many ways, and 2 years later she had married him. They returned to their native province of Nova Scotia and settled in a small country village. Here Elliot had grown up, bearing the name of the man who was a kind and loving father to him, and whom he loved as a father. His mother had died when he was 10 years old, and his stepfather when he was 15. On his deathbed, he asked Elliot to retain his name. "I've cared for you and loved you since the time you were born, lad," he said. "You seem like my own son, and I've a fancy to leave you my name. It's all I can leave you, for I am a poor man, but it's an honest name, lad, and I've kept it free from stain. See that you do likewise, and you'll have your mother's blessing and mine." Elliot fought a hard battle that spring evening. "Hold your tongue and keep the Fraser," whispered the tempter. "Campbell is your name. You've borne it all your life, and the condition itself is a ridiculous one. No fairness about it. You made the highest marks, and you ought to be the winner. It isn't as if you were wronging Stone or any of the others who worked hard and made good marks. If you throw away what you've won by your own hard labour, the Fraser goes to Maclean, who made only 70. Besides, you need the money, and he doesn't. His father is a rich man. But I'll be a cheat and a cad if I keep it, Elliot muttered miserably. Campbell isn't my legal name, and I'd never again feel as if I had even the right of love to it if I stained it by a dishonest act. For it would be stained, even though nobody but myself knew it. Father said it was a clean name when he left it, and I cannot soil it. The tempter was not silenced so easily as that. Elliot passed a sleepless night of indecision. But the next day he went to Marwood and asked for a private interview with the president. As a result, an official announcement was posted that afternoon on the bulletin board to the effect that owing to a misunderstanding, the Fraser Scholarship had been wrongly awarded. Carl McLean was posted as the winner. The story soon got around campus, and Elliot found himself rather overwhelmed with sympathy, but he did not feel as if he were very much in need of it after all. It was good to have done the right thing and be able to look your conscience in the face. He was young and strong and could work his own way through Marwood in time. "No condolences, please," he said to Roger Brooks with a smile. "I'm sorry I lost the Fraser, of course, but I've my hands and brains left. I'm going straight to my boarding house to dig with double vim, for I've got to take an examination next week for a provincial school certificate. Next winter I'll be a flourishing pedagogue with some up-country district." He was not, however. The next afternoon he received a summons to the president's office. The president was there, and with him was a plump, motherly-looking woman of about 60. "Mrs. Fraser, this is Elliot Hanselpacker, or Campbell, as I understand he prefers to be called. Elliot, I told your story to Mrs. Fraser last evening, and she was greatly interested when she heard your rather peculiar name. She will tell you why herself. I had a young sister once," said Mrs. Fraser eagerly. "She married a man named John Hanselpacker and went west, and somehow I lost all trace of her. There was, I regret to say, a coolness between us over her marriage. I disapproved of it, because she married a very poor man. When I heard your name, it struck me that you might be her son, or at least know something about her. Her name was Mary Helen Rodney, and I loved her very dearly, in spite of our foolish quarrel." There was a tremor in Mrs. Fraser's voice, and an answering one in Elliot's as he replied, "Mary Helen Rodney was my dear mother's name, and my father was John Hanselpacker." "Then you are my nephew," exclaimed Mrs. Fraser. "I am your Aunt Alice. My boy, you don't know how much it means to a lonely old woman to have found you. I am the happiest person in the world." She slipped her arms through Elliot's and turned to the sympathetic president with shining eyes. "He is my boy forever, if he will be. Blessings on the Fraser Scholarship." Blessings rather on the manly boy who wouldn't keep it under false colours, said the President with a smile. I think you are fortunate in your nephew, Mrs. Fraser. So Elliot Hanselpacker Campbell came back to Marwood the next year after all. The light on the Big Dipper. Don't let Nellie run out of doors, Mary Margaret. And be careful of the fire, Mary Margaret. I expect we'll be back pretty soon after dark, so don't be lonesome, Mary Margaret. Mary Margaret laughed and switched her long, thick braid of black hair from one shoulder to the other. No fear of my being lonesome, Mother Campbell. I'll be just as careful as can be, and there are so many things to be done that I'll be as busy and happy as a bee all day long. Nellie and I will have just the nicest kind of a time. I won't get lonesome, but if I should feel just tempted to, I'll think Father is on his way home. He will soon be here, and that will drive the lonesomeness away before it dared to show its face. Don't you worry, Mother Campbell. Mother Campbell smiled. She knew she could trust Mary Margaret. Careful, steady, prudent little Mary Margaret. Little. Ah, that was just the trouble. Careful and steady and prudent as Mary Margaret might be, she was only 12 years old after all, and there would not be another soul besides her and Nellie on the Little Dipper that whole day. Mrs. Campbell felt that she hardly dared to go away under such circumstances, and yet she must dare it. Oscar Bryan had sailed over from the mainland the evening before with word that her sister Nan, her only sister, who lived in Cartonville, was ill and about to undergo a serious operation. She must go to see her, and Uncle Martin was waiting with his boat to take her over to the mainland to catch the morning train to Cartonville. If 5-year-old Nellie had been quite well, Mrs. Campbell would have taken both her and Mary Margaret and locked up the house. But Nellie had a very bad cold and was quite unfit to go sailing across the harbour on a raw, chilly November day, so there was nothing to do but leave Mary Margaret in charge. And Mary Margaret was quite pleased with the prospect. You know, Mother Campbell, I am not afraid of anything except tramps, and no tramps ever come to the Dippers. You see what an advantage it is to live on an island. There, Uncle Martin is waving. Run along, little mother. Mary Margaret watched the boat out of sight from the window, and then betook herself to the doing of her tasks, singing blithely all the while. It was rather nice to be left in sole charge like this. It made you feel so important and grown up. She would do everything very nicely, and Mother would see when she came back what a good housekeeper her daughter was. Mary Margaret and Nellie and Mrs. Campbell had been living on the Little Dipper ever since the preceding April. Before that, they had always lived in their own cosy home at the harbour head, but in April Captain Campbell had sailed in the Two Sisters for a very long voyage, and before he went, Mrs. Campbell's brother, Martin Clow, had come to them with a proposition. He ran a lobster cannery on the Little Dipper, and he wanted his sister to go and keep house for him while her husband was away. After some discussion, it was so arranged, and Mrs. Campbell and her 2 little girls moved to the Little Dipper. It was not a lonesome place then, for the lobstermen and their families lived on it, and the boats were constantly sailing to and fro between it and the mainland. Mary Margaret enjoyed her summer greatly. She bathed and sailed and roamed over the rocks, and on fine days her Uncle George, who kept the lighthouse on the Big Dipper and lived there all alone, often came over and took her across to the Big Dipper. Mary Margaret thought the lighthouse was a wonderful place, and Uncle George taught her how to light the lamps and manage the light. When the lobster season closed, the men took up cod fishing, and carried this on till October, when they all moved back to the mainland. But Uncle Martin was building a house for himself at Harbour Head, and did not wish to move until the ice formed over the bay, because it would then be so much easier to transport his goods and chattels. So the Campbells stayed with him until the captain should return. Mary Margaret found plenty to do that day, and wasn't a bit lonesome. But when evening came, she didn't feel quite so cheerful. Nellie had fallen asleep, and there wasn't another living creature except the cat on the Little Dipper. Besides, it looked like a storm. The harbour was glassy calm, but the sky was very black and dour in the northeast, like snow, thought weather-wise Mary Margaret. She hoped her mother would get home before it began, and she wished the lighthouse star would gleam out on the Big Dipper. It would seem like the bright eye of a steady old friend. Mary Margaret always watched for it every night. Just as soon as the sun went down, the big lighthouse star would flash goldenly out of the northeastern sky. "I'll sit down by the window and watch for it," said Mary Margaret to herself. "Then, when it is lighted, I'll get up a nice warm supper for Mother and Uncle Martin." Mary Margaret sat down by the kitchen window to watch. Minute after minute passed, but no light flashed out on the Big Dipper. What was the matter? Mary Margaret began to feel uneasy. It was too cloudy to tell just when the sun had set, but she was sure it must be down, for it was quite dark in the house. She lighted a lamp, got the almanac, and hunted out the exact time of sun setting. The sun had been down 15 minutes, and there was no light on the Big Dipper. Mary Margaret felt alarmed and anxious. What was wrong at the Big Dipper? Was Uncle George away, or had something happened to him? Mary Margaret was sure he had never forgotten. 15 minutes longer did Mary Margaret watch restlessly at the window. Then she concluded that something was desperately wrong somewhere. It was half an hour after sunset, and the Big Dipper light, the most important one along the whole coast, was not lighted. What would she do? What could she do? The answer came swift and dear into Mary Margaret's steady, sensible little mind. She must go to the Big Dipper and light the lamps. But could she? Difficulties came crowding thick and fast into her thoughts. It was going to snow. The soft, broad flakes were falling already. Could she row the 2 miles to the Big Dipper in the darkness and snow? If she could, dare she leave Nellie all alone in the house? Oh, she couldn't. Somebody at Harbour Head would surely notice that the Big Dipper light was unlighted, and would go over to investigate the cause. But suppose they shouldn't? If the snow came thicker, they might never notice the absence of the light. And suppose there was a ship away out there, as there nearly always was, with the dangerous rocks and shoals of the outer harbour to pass, with precious lives on board, and no guiding beacon on the Big Dipper. Margaret hesitated no longer. She must go. Bravely and briskly and thoughtfully she made her preparations. First the fire was banked and the draughts closed. Then she wrote a little note for her mother and laid it on the table. Finally she wakened Nellie. "Nellie," said Mary Margaret, speaking very kindly and determinedly, "there is no light on the Big Dipper, and I've got to row over and see about it. I'll be back as quickly as I can, and Mother and Uncle Martin will soon be here. You won't be afraid to stay alone, will you, dearie? You mustn't be afraid, because I have to go. And Nellie, I'm going to tie you in your chair. It's necessary, because I can't lock the door, so you mustn't cry. Nothing will hurt you, and I want you to be a brave little girl and help Sister all you can." Nellie, too sleepy and dazed to understand very clearly what Mary Margaret was about, submitted to be wrapped up in quilts and bound securely in her chair. Then Mary Margaret tied the chair fast to the wall so that Nellie couldn't upset it. That's safe, she thought. Nellie can't run out now, or fall on the stove, or set herself afire. Mary Margaret put on her jacket, hood, and mittens, and took Uncle Martin's lantern. As she went out and closed the door, a little wail from Nellie sounded on her ear. For a moment she hesitated. Then the blackness of the Big Dipper confirmed her resolution. she must go. Nellie was really quite safe and comfortable. It would not hurt her to cry a little, and it might hurt somebody a great deal if the Big Dipper light failed. Setting her lips firmly, Mary Margaret ran down to the shore. Like all the harbour girls, Mary Margaret could row a boat from the time she was 9 years old. Nevertheless, her heart almost failed her as she got into the little dory and rowed out. The snow was getting thick. Could she pull across those black 2 miles between the dippers before it got so very much thicker that she would lose her way? Well, she must risk it. She had set the light in the kitchen window. She must keep it fair behind her, and then she would land on the lighthouse beach. With a murmured prayer for help and guidance, she pulled staunchly away. It was a long, hard row for the little 12-year-old arms. Fortunately, there was no wind, but thicker and thicker came the snow. Finally, the kitchen light was hidden in it. For a moment, Mary Margaret's heart sank in despair. The next, it gave a joyful bound, for turning she saw the dark tower of the lighthouse directly behind her. By the aid of her lantern, she rowed to the landing, sprang out, and made her boat fast. A minute later, she was in the lighthouse kitchen. The door leading to the tower stairs was open, and at the foot of the stairs lay Uncle George, limp and white. "Oh, Uncle George," gasped Mary Margaret. "What is the matter? What has happened?" "Mary Margaret, thank God. I was just praying to him to send somebody to tend the light. Who's with you?" "Nobody. I got frightened because there was no light, and I rowed over. Mother and Uncle Martin are away." "You don't mean to say you rowed yourself over here alone in the dark and the snow? Well, you are the pluckiest little girl about this harbour. It's a mercy I've showed you how to manage the light. Run up and start it at once. Don't mind about me. I tumbled down those pesky stairs like the awkward old fool I am. I've broken my leg and hurt my back so bad I can't crawl an inch. I've been lying here for 3 mortal hours, and they've seemed like 3 years. Hurry with the light, Mary Margaret." Mary Margaret hurried. Soon the Big Dipper light was once more gleaming cheerfully athwart the stormy harbour. Then she ran back to her uncle. There was not much she could do for him beyond covering him warmly with quilts, placing a pillow under his head, and brewing him a hot drink of tea. "I left a note for Mother telling her where I'd gone, Uncle George, so I'm sure Uncle Martin will come over as soon as they get home." "He'll have to hurry. It's blowing up now. Hear it? And snowing thick. If your Martin haven't left the harbour head before this, they won't leave tonight. But anyhow, the light is lit. I don't mind my getting smashed up compared to that. I thought I'd go crazy lying here picturing myself a vessel out on the reefs. That night was a very long and anxious one. The storm grew rapidly worse, and snow and wind howled around the lighthouse. Uncle George soon grew feverish and delirious, and Mary Margaret, between her anxiety for him and her dismal thoughts of poor Nelly tied in her chair over at the Little Dipper, and the dark possibility of her mother and Uncle Martin being out in the storm, felt almost distracted. But the morning came at last, as mornings blessedly will, be the nights never so long and anxious, and it dawned fine and clear over a white world. Mary Margaret ran to the shore and gazed eagerly across at the Little Dipper. No smoke was visible from Uncle Martin's house. She could not leave Uncle George, who was raving wildly, and yet it was necessary to obtain assistance somehow. Suddenly she remembered the distress signal. She must hoist it. How fortunate that Uncle George had once shown her how. 10 minutes later there was a commotion over at Harbour Head, where the signal was promptly observed, and very soon, although it seemed long enough to Mary Margaret, a boat came sailing over to the Big Dipper. When the men landed, they were met by a very white-faced little girl, who gasped out a rather disjointed story of a light that hadn't been lighted, and an uncle with a broken leg, and a sister tied in her chair, and would they please see to Uncle George at once, for she must go straight over to the other dipper. One of the men rowed her over, but before they were halfway there, another boat went sailing across the harbour, and Mary Margaret saw a woman and 2 men land from it and hurry up to the house. That is Mother and Uncle Martin, but who could the other man be? Wondered Mary Margaret. When she reached the cottage, her mother and Uncle Martin were reading her note, and Nelly had just been untied from where she had been found fast asleep, and was in the arms of a great big, brown, bewhiskered man. Mary Margaret just gave one look at the man, then she flew across the room with a cry of delight. "Father!" For 10 minutes not one intelligible word was said, what with the laughing and the crying and the kissing. Mary Margaret was the first to recover herself and say briskly, "Now do explain, somebody. Tell me how it all happened." "Martin and I got back to Harbour Head too late last night to cross over," said her mother. "It would have been madness to try to cross in the storm, although I was nearly wild thinking of you 2 children. It's well I didn't know the whole truth, or I'd have been simply frantic. We stayed at the Head all night, and first thing this morning came your father." "We came in last night," said Captain Campbell, "and it was pitch dark, not a light to be seen, and beginning to snow. We didn't know where we were, and I was terribly worried, when all at once the Big Dipper light I'd been looking for so vainly flashed out, and everything was all right in a moment. But Mary Margaret, if that light hadn't appeared, we'd never have got in past the reefs. You saved your father's ship and all the lives in her, my brave little girl. Oh! Mary Margaret drew a long breath, and her eyes were starry with tears of happiness. Oh, I'm so thankful I went over. And I had to tie Nellie in her chair, Mother. There was no other way. Uncle George broke his leg and is very sick this morning, and there's no breakfast ready for anyone, and the fire black out. But that doesn't matter when Father is safe. And oh, I'm so tired. And then Mary Margaret sat down just for a moment, intending to get right up and help her mother light the fire. She laid her head on Father's shoulder and fell sound asleep before she ever suspected it. Peaceful slumbers. Sleep sweet.